Hello everyone, and welcome back to theCUBE's coverage of Chainguard Assemble here in the Big Apple, New York City. I'm your host, Rebecca Knight, alongside Paul Nashawaty, Principal Analyst here at SiliconANGLE Media. I would like to welcome to the show, for the first time ever, Adeel Saeed, CTO Global Cyber Resiliency at Kyndryl.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. So, for viewers who are a little bit less familiar with Kyndryl, Kyndryl operates at a scale that most organizations can only imagine, managing infrastructure across some of the world's largest enterprises. Talk a little bit about how you're a customer of Chainguard, how you use Chainguard, and what you use it for.
Absolutely, so first of all, thank you for having me. Second, Kyndryl being a large MSP and servicing large enterprise clients that are heavily regulated, not locally but globally. The onus kind of falls on us to make sure we are secure by design. That's the first thing, as a managed service provider. Secondly, we develop applications for our customers, right? We're managing the infrastructure. What we call it, we are the hearts and lungs of our customers. Sometimes we are in customers more than the CEOs of those companies are there because the infrastructure teams are kind of there and they outlive any management change. But at the end of the day, what matters is we're also a third party. And third-party risk is a key tenet in many of our customer agreements. The reason we started looking at Chainguard as an example was, again, we develop applications, our SDLC processes, for those that don't know SDLC, software development lifecycle process, were robust, but they were not fully fine-grained. So in an effort to improve our security posture, we started looking at companies that provide that capability almost as a utility. Because we want our engineering teams to focus on high-value work, versus, it's not low value, but versus remedial work, right? I mean, you create a golden image one day and then tomorrow it's not golden anymore. There are tons of vulnerabilities out there. So we started working with Chainguard almost a year ago in looking at how the product will operate in our environment. Again, we are large, we are global, we have a couple of thousand engineers out there, and we have heavily regulated customers that are demanding the right security posture. So that's what drove us to look at Chainguard and almost adopt it from a utility standpoint to complete our security posture versus looking at it as just a placeholder.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I like where you were going with the whole SDLC piece. The thing that I find incredibly interesting, and taking it right out of the keynote this morning, the environments have changed a lot with organizations from having vulnerabilities checked post-code delivery to having it checked pre-code build.
Absolutely.
Right, so it's moving further and further left, if not just across everywhere. How do you see that from a culture change, from a process change? What did that mean from the Kyndryl's adoption of using Chainguard, especially when you're looking at releasing code at the build time to do the vulnerability checking?
You're absolutely right. It's a culture change. It's an adoption mechanism, right? Yeah. I mean, folks are used to certain ways of working for years, and now suddenly you have to change the posture. You have to change posture in a way on how you're adopting the tool. So the challenge wasn't getting the tool within the organization, the challenge was how do you have adoption? And a few ways we did that, right? We put guardrails in place. And the guardrails kind of came, first is how do we not force the developers to use it, but how do we create an ecosystem where there's natural adoption coming into play? So that's how we did it. By using simply, a development platform. Because many companies don't use development platforms, right? You're directly connecting to your Git repos or you're connecting to your JFrog artifacts. What we did is we created a developer experience. And that developer experience forces all the engineers to use that one interface to create an image, create a repo, write code. And you're right, it's far shifted left. So from inception to grave, right, till you use the code and it gets recycled, we actually are putting people through that platform, basically.
You make adoption sound so easy. Can you talk a little bit about maybe some of the pain points and some of the trust issues involved in getting such a massive change management of getting your developers using this new tooling?
You're absolutely right. I'm giving ourselves a lot of credit because the team did a great job, but no, you're right. It's a culture change plus also it's why can't we do it ourselves, right? And that mindset really can only be changed by showing and demonstrating the value the product provides. And it's not an easy adoption for us. I mean, we are there. We have been using it for almost a year now, but we are probably 70 to 80% adopted in that process. We have multiple languages that we use, right? And these these images, these libraries keep rotating on a daily basis. So what we did is, outside of the horror stories are very simple. It's not people don't want to adopt, they don't have time.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you say it like that, because a lot of times I hear, like, developers are unique individuals, right? They definitely like their bespoke tools.
Absolutely.
Right, and to force them to change something causes a whole lot of disruption.
It does.
Right, so I think, having Chainguard feed the information, the insights into the IDE, that makes a lot of sense, right?
Yes.
And an IDE of choice, right? Because if they're using specific tool sets and whatever,
Exactly.
that makes a lot of sense. So, I like that you've, from a culture, from a company perspective, that you're looking to standardize. One of the things that kind of comes to mind is standardization usually helps with operation efficiencies. And when you look at that from the open source community, like we look at open source, the scale of taking open source technologies and the modern enterprise infrastructure, how has that pivoted and changed your adoption? Because I would imagine prior to this kind of standardization, you probably had a number of bespoke solutions kind of going on at the same time, and maybe siloed even.
So first of all, being a tech company, I mean, we spun out of IBM back in 2021.
Right.
So it's not new to us on how to kind of operate in that way. But I'm glad you asked the question, because the first thing is, it wasn't about adoption or open source adoption, because open source is core to our strategy.
Right.
And in order to have a disciplined open source approach, you need to have the right level of governance in place. So we have layers of governance, legal, an open source forum that brings all these things in and make sure any adoption that we are doing or contribution goes through a fine-grained process. The process is great, governance is great, but people can bypass it, right? So how do you put the right guardrails in place for people to facilitate and adopt the solution itself? Again, Chainguard provided a utility that came in to saying, hey, guess what? Open source, trust but verify. How do you adopt it? Absolutely a challenge, but how do we put that as part of our governance process? And again, now with the whole agentic enablement, our agents being created, it becomes less of a utility and more of a requirement, because those images that are being created in Python, as an example, in different libraries, have a different connotation to it.
Yeah.
Right? So we almost are evolving ourselves, getting ready for the next gen of coders coming out, or engineers. And again, you're right. I mean, engineers are so busy, and they have less time, more product to release.
And often a very distinct point of view about how things should be done.
Absolutely, you're right. And they're very opinionated, but at the same time, what our approach in securing our processes was not imposing these rigid, thou shalt do this and thou shalt do that. We always wanted to make sure that we empower our developers and our engineers to be more productive by securing the back end. And you're right, it didn't take us a week or two, it took us a year. Right. Globally, going across evangelizing, there's two things that are constant that we did. Training, communication. Training, communication, training, communication, and then a hard date. By this date, we shall move on. Plus, what we also did is, we also instilled what we call security training for all our engineers. And the training modules, we introduced Chainguard. And we introduced the product. So now anyone that needs access to any repos has to go through a training process. So we're almost doing the enforcement side on two bookends, but we are driving that through adoption and through collaboration versus a hard no.
So you are a CTO, and security leaders often know exactly what the technical risks are and what they're talking about, but it's a challenge sometimes to make it land in the greater boardroom. So I'm interested to hear how you personally translate what these vulnerabilities mean and represent to other executives who aren't necessarily as tech focused as you, and as aware of them, and what best practices have emerged from your...
Definitely it's not an easy task to translate English to German and German to English. What we did is we used a very simple approach of risk management in terms of what business understands. As I mentioned, many of our customers, all our customers, are enterprise customers, heavily regulated. So we have contractual obligations to them to make sure we have a secure environment, which any infrastructure service provider does. The second thing is, we also then put it in terms of risk. The risk that we carry today in not having something that is a constant is moving us away from productivity in developing our code. As long as you can explain that in terms of dollars and cents, but more importantly, in terms of risk posture management, right? Because I did not go and say, hey, we have 1 million vulnerabilities as an example, and how do we fix it? Because 1 million to me might be 500,000 to you. No two vulnerabilities are the same. What we said is, hey, vulnerabilities will be there as long as humans are writing code. Computers don't make mistakes, we do as humans, right? But at the same time, how do we make sure we provide the right guardrails? It was a very simple, it wasn't simple. I'm simplifying everything, it's 4 p.m. But it was simple in the sense that we drove the business case to a very KPI-driven approach. First is how do we get developer efficiency? When I say efficiency, it's how do we have our developers focus on high-value attributes versus low-value tasks. And the second was, how do we actually manage our risk posture and drive it down? So.
I really think that there's a lot here that makes a lot of sense. You kind of you focus translating those values to business values. It makes a lot of sense. It's a tough job because sometimes people just don't understand what really is under the tech stack. I do want to ask one more question on open source. When you're looking at from a trust perspective, you know, it's a big area where many organizations want that open source ecosystem. They want to have that flexibility. They want to have the ability to use these different tech stacks of their choice.
Absolutely.
But they also need to know how they can trust it. So what does trust open source look like to your practice?
Trusted open source to me is, or to our organization and me as well, is making sure that you have the right authoritative source that you're getting the open source from. You have the right legal wrap around it, and you make sure that it's certified. When I say certified, it goes through our governance process. Now again, that's one element of it. As somebody asked a question recently, they're like, hey, you can get an image that has 0 vulnerabilities in there, right? Pre-production, and then somebody touches that, and you introduce vulnerabilities. How do you manage that? And again, you need to have not safeguards just on the starting point, but also when you're releasing code into production. How are you managing that security posture, not just from when you write code, but also when you're promoting code? And open source is that ecosystem that we all breathe at the end of the day. So trust but verify becomes a key tenet, and your CI/CD automation needs to have the right security tools to make sure you test it, validate it, and then deploy it.
Makes sense.
So the software supply chain conversation has been getting louder in recent years, particularly after SolarWinds and Log4Shell. Do you think that the industry is actually making progress, or is it still mostly in reactive mode?
That's an excellent point. I think it's passive aggressive right now, right? Because you only talk about your software bill of materials when you have an issue. And you almost talk about SCA, which is your software composite analysis, when you might want to have an issue. Now with the way agents are being driven right now, SBOM becomes not a need to have, not a you should have, but it's a must have. You need to have your SBOM in place in order to identify your open source, your agents, and the inventory. There are 3 constants in the agentic world. Your inventory of your agents, observability of your agents, and security of your agents. It's not security by design, it's how you secure the agents is where the mantra is. So
well, that was a fantastic note to end on. Adeel, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, appreciate it.
That wraps up theCUBE's coverage of Chainguard Assemble 2026 here in New York City. I'm your host, Rebecca Knight. For Paul Nashawaty, you've been watching theCUBE, the leader in enterprise tech news and analysis.